My guest today is Gord Magill, trucker, writer, and host of the Voice of Gord podcast, whose recent appearance with Tucker Carlson brought global attention to a series of injustices under the current Canadian regime. We discussed the Coutts Four, a group of men held in solitary confinement without bail for over 2 years on a series of charges relating to the Emergencies Act and political targeting by the Trudeau government, why they were confined to begin with, and the deteriorating state of freedom in Canada. This episode is packed with important information, spoken by a man with an undying passion for freedom and liberty. No matter where you're located, his warnings should be heeded by all. Stay tuned. Gord Magill, my man, it's great to see you.
Whoa, Jason. Thanks for the invite. We've only become recently acquainted, but it sounds like you and I are simpatico and both good old Canadian boys, rather than just regular good old boys. It's snow monkeys, as my good friend Tommy Salmons, who's from Louisiana, might call us. But yeah,
That's a good
happy
one,
to be
man.
here.
Snow monkeys. Well, yeah, dude. First I got to apologize, man. I didn't realize that you were following me on X for the longest time. I've been reading your stuff on Newsweek, and I was like, man, I want to reach out to this guy at some point. I saw you on Tucker, and I was like, well, there it goes. He probably ain't gonna talk to me now.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. I will speak with anyone.
Well,
No,
that's
it's
awesome.
funny. So yeah, you and I are both kind of trying to discuss things going on in Canada,
That's right.
especially in the last few years. And yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I accepted, well, a couple of months ago now. I mean, the process of these things will take time. But yeah, I ended up on Tucker Carlson, discussing all the goings on back home in Canada, specifically with these guys at Coutts who got arrested and became, political prisoners. And, a few people were like, who is this guy? Not understanding that I've been kicked off Twitter 4 times. Once within 36 hours of appearing on Fox News to defend the Freedom Convoy 2 years ago. And, people think I'm American or whatever. No, I was born in Hamilton, Ontario. I've been a trucker my whole life, did 4 seasons up on the ice in the Northwest Territories. I lived in Alberta. I'm one of the very few people who can say I've driven to Nunavut. So I'm Canadian as they come, but I don't live here anymore, and I'm not part of anybody's club. And the big social media club on Twitter, A, I keep getting thrown out of, and B, a lot of those people are turf protecting, very clicky assholes that don't want to be told the truth. So I've got like 2 layers of protection keeping me out of that. And then people are like, "Oh wow, who is this guy and why is he writing at Newsweek and how did he get on Tucker Carlson?" And all I say is like, because I told the truth. That's it. You know,
Yeah,
I've been since I went home to defend to see the Freedom Convoy and welcome it to Ottawa and started writing about it. Doors have opened, which I believe lends some credence to something Jordan Peterson often says, which is, writing helps make your ideas better, and it helps like compact things and like wrestle with them and make them more, presentable, and like you work through all the logic and everything. And then it also, when you tell the truth, good things are going to happen. And so they happened, and here we are, and we've met now, and I'll talk to anybody, and I'm glad you invited me on your show.
oh yeah, dude, it's an honor to talk to you, man. I've been reading your stuff in Newsweek. You're a great fucking writer. I'm very happy with the stuff that you've written. I think the difficult thing with where we are in our country right now is finding the accurate way or the best way to articulate what's actually happening. And you've done a fantastic job at that. I mean, the stuff that you write for Newsweek is not too long, it's not too overbearing, but it's brief and straight to the point.
I would like it to be longer and a bit more overbearing, but Newsweek is a generalist publication with their own aesthetic and word count limits. And I have to do what my editor says sometimes. So I often look at the Newsweek pieces and think, man, there's so many more questions and whatnot. But, anyway, I write at Substack, autonomoustruckers.substack.com when I get the chance. I am not a professional writer. I'm literally a truck driver. That's it. I've been trucking my entire life, and I've got a wife and 2 kids and lots of commitments and very little time for content generation, yet I somehow managed to pull it off. Somehow all of us do. It's just amazing. One of the things that's amazing to me in watching the sort of like quote unquote the alternative media or fringe elements, peddlers of disinformation, as the regime might refer to us as. So many working class people, so many people with other jobs, so many people that do not have the time nor resources. Let's say if you worked for the CBC or the Atlantic or some big name regime outlet that pushes forth nothing but government propaganda and nothing but what I call regime stenography. Justin Trudeau tells you what to write and you write it. That's not journalism. Journalism is when you talk to everybody involved and you ask questions, right? The media used to be referred to as the fourth estate, which is meant like you're supposed to hold power to account. You're supposed to ask questions of the people in charge, hard questions often, uncomfortable questions, and that's gone. At least within the mainstream media, other than a few edge cases, that's long gone. America, Canada, anywhere, it's over. So if you want to actually find out what's going on, I got to come find guys like you.
And I got to come find guys like you. And it's pretty indicative of the time that we're in, where we're relying on, truckers and high school dropouts, which is me, to talk about what's actually happening around us. So I want to ask you, because, I get this a lot when I meet people. They're like, you're a writer? You wrote that stuff? And I'm like, yes, I did. Yes, I did. I am not a knuckle dragging buffoon. So for you, when you started writing, how did you learn how to write? Because, like myself, I didn't take any university courses or anything. I literally just started. So what informed your writing style?
I learned how to write by reading a lot.
Yeah, me too.
So when I was a kid, I was that nerd in the corner just sitting there reading books. My one grandfather was a heavy reader, always had tons of books, and came from a little bit of a troubled home, so my escape was like constantly reading. That same grandfather was also the kind of guy that would go to remember going to the corner store and buying the newspaper? He would go and buy the Toronto Sun, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, all the papers every single day and bring all of them home. And they were just like sitting around. So I would hang out with my grandpa, my mom's dad, and just read the newspapers from a young age. And then, started reading books, probably some heavy duty books that I was too young to fully understand and wrap my head around. And at some point I need to go back and reread them. Yeah. But, I just read a lot. And as I was a younger man growing up, people encouraged me to journal and write stuff because I've always been sort of forthright and extremely opinionated, which I verbalized rather than wrote. And I kind of, I never took them up on that suggestion and I just kept on trucking. And when I say trucking, I mean, literally, I've been a truck driver since I was in high school. I was running around Hamilton at night without a license when I was 17 and then got my class A and I've been on the road ever since. But what happened as far as the professional, semi-professional writing goes, in 2017, the American government brought out this thing called the electronic logging device mandate, ELD mandate, which is to say state enforced surveillance of truckers via these logbooks that were like attached to your truck. And I knew that was bad news right off the bat. And this little tiny blog here in the US called glibertarians.com asked me to write something for it. So I did. And then I started experimenting with Twitter. I found a guy named Oliver Bateman, who is a very successful writer and podcaster. And he invited me on his show. We talked about the ELD mandate. I started writing about it a little bit more here and there. And then COVID happens and Freedom Convoy happens. And I went to Ottawa to welcome the convoy into town. Me and a bunch of my friends from Toronto and Montreal. We met at my one buddy's house in kind of near Almonte, a little ways west of Ottawa. Went out to one of those overpasses, and we were the freaks with the like hockey sticks and flags. And
Right.
because, by this time I'm now living in the United States. So anyway, I go to Ottawa, welcome the convoy in, hung out that whole first weekend, and then I had to go home. So I go home, and I had already posted all these videos I took and put on Twitter of our time on that overpass, of the like parties that immediately sprung up. Like, people have to realize that very first night of the convoy being in town, these like techno raver guys with sound systems from Montreal showed up, and there were parties in the streets of Ottawa the very first night of the convoy, which tells you that Canadian society was sick and tired of the COVID regime, yeah, and was seeking remedy for what had wrought on them. And they wanted to express love and unity and fun and being together and being normal humans. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't believe how deep this was, and that like the convoy wasn't about the truckers even. Like, it started out that way, but at the end of the day, it wasn't even about them. It was about something much deeper in Canadian society. So I throw all these videos on Twitter, go home, and the Trudeau regime and its, media sycophants start slagging the Freedom Convoy in the press. And, the CBC, CTV, Global, all of them guys doing their jobs. Like people like to say, oh, they're not doing their jobs. They're not reporting the truth. The media's job is not to report the truth. Let us not forget Orwell. The Ministry of Information, their whole job was to constantly rewrite history, constantly remove words from the vernacular, and decrease your ability to communicate properly, so that the only thing that the citizens could understand in 1984 is that which the government told them. I witnessed this happening in real time with the media in Canada. And my now editor at Newsweek, Bot Younger Sargon, saw what I was saying on Twitter, saw my videos, and understood the nature of the times. Like, she got it. And she asked me, hey, can you write something about this? So I started writing for Newsweek, and I've been writing for them ever since. And here we are.
Yeah, dude, your coverage is incredible. And during the Freedom Convoy, I'm originally from Vancouver, and I was in Vancouver during COVID, which was probably the worst place to be in this country, other than Quebec. And I suffered through the entire thing. So when the Freedom
Really? Was BC as bad as Quebec? Like, how did it go out there?
Well, I would say culturally, right? Like the Lower Mainland. I wouldn't say all of BC, because once you get outside of the Lower Mainland, it's a lot less, woke.
But yeah, once you get past Chilliwack, it's a different world.
That's right. And I was in the Lower Mainland. I was in Richmond, which is a town just south of Vancouver. So it was, we were dealing with the same restrictions, although they were a little bit more strict because of Bonnie Henry and the BC Health, Public Health Authority there. But what it was too, it was cultural. It was like, if you weren't wearing a mask, even outdoors, people looked at you sideways. Most people who weren't going along with the narrative were ostracized from communities and jobs and friendships and that sort of thing. And so that's what myself and my wife were dealing with, right? And I remember, dude, I was standing in a park eating lunch because I wasn't allowed to take my family into a restaurant because I wasn't vaccinated. and it started to rain, and there were people in the restaurant across the street looking at us through the window, and I was like, that's it, fuck it, we're done here, we're out for good. And the immediate response was to go to Costa Rica. Then we realized that because we're not vaccinated, there's a chance we might not ever be able to get back to Canada. Our parents are getting older. So we just decided, you know what? Alberta is probably the best bet for us. And my whole family's from Alberta. My grandparents owned a farm out here for decades. So I spent every summer and Christmas out here. I know the people well. I was born in Alberta. I know the culture. And dude, it's been beautiful ever since we left. But, you know, it was, I mean, extremely depressing being in Vancouver during that time. And when the convoy started, even in Vancouver, I mean, as far left as you can possibly get in our country, you could feel people, you could feel hope rising up from the ashes again within people, even if they weren't vocalizing it. And so I could only imagine what it must have been like in Alberta, Saskatchewan, more conservative places. But even in the lower mainland of British Columbia, like, people were like, we were ready to go. And I donated 3 times what I could afford twice, because, well, the first time, we can talk about that if you want. The first time, GoFundMe shut down the donor account, and which, I mean, there's all sorts of fuckery around that.
Right. Well, what GoFundMe did is so I'm gonna get a little bit into the problems with the American media, which are an extension of the problems with the Canadian media. So as I'm writing these things for Newsweek, right? My wife is a Bernie Sanders progressive. So are all of my in-laws. My wife's older brother lives in Portland, Oregon, and he's a lawyer. And he lives in Portland, which is like ground zero for Antifa, and it's the belly of the beast of basically everything that's wrong, right?
That's right.
And he saw my stuff, and like, he's sending me these articles from the Daily Beast, some stupid website in the US, that are repeating all of the allegations. These guys are Nazis, and these guys are funded by Donald Trump, and all of that stuff was lies. It was proved to be lies. Yep. And I'm trying to tell my brother-in-law, I'm like, dude, you have to understand, like, what you're reading is not true. I went home to Canada. It's not true. Months later, POEC comes out, Give, Send, Go, GoFundMe. All these guys testify before Parliament. Everything you're like, there's a whole architecture of the media that the dissident American thinker Curtis Yarvin refers to as the cathedral. And I refer to it as the Cathedral Nord in Canada. And they are there. They talk about misinformation and disinformation. What they are there to do is to keep everybody within their own little Overton window. They're not there to actually tell you the truth or talk to both sides or try and get you like a wider view of what's going on. They are there to push the government narrative. That's why I call them regime stenographers. They're not journalists. They're propagandists. And we had the same problem in the United States. And GoFundMe, unfortunately, are run by libtards that are connected to all that stuff. And so they succumbed to the pressure. You know, Give, Send, Go are different. They're run by people who are like, you know, Christians, and they're very out about that. And they're in Colorado, and they're not sort of on the coasts. And, you know, Give, Send, Go are a different animal. And Give, Send, Go's donations only got shanghaied because of Doug Ford, the supposedly conservative premier of Ontario, who is, despite his girth, an extremely narrow shadow of his brother Rob. Peace be upon him, King Rob of Toronto. If only he were still alive during the convoy. Man, I made a tweet that, like, one of my banned Twitter accounts, I made this tweet about the blockade at the Ambassador Bridge, right? And, you know, a day later, my account got nuked, so nobody saw it. But the tweet was something like this. If Rob Ford was still alive, he would have personally come to the Ambassador Bridge, met all of the truckers and protesters blocking it, and then walked over the bridge to get one of Joe Biden's publicly financed crack pipes in Detroit.
And
Of
for
course,
our
nobody saw that tweet because I got kicked off a couple days later.
for our American listeners, Rob Ford is the former mayor of Toronto, and Doug Ford is the current premier in Ontario, and premier is a Canadian version of a governor. So that's who Gord's referencing.
Yeah. So anyway, we have all these problems, and like the media never reported on a lot of the details of the POEC.
Right.
And one of my beefs right now in my reporting on the Coutts guys is that two of them are out now, and the reporting on it has been extremely either missing or antagonistic, right?
Yeah.
So when the Coutts guys got arrested, they were slagged in the media, and the media repeated all of the allegations of the RCMP and the Crown, which led to the first publication ban. So there's a lot of discussion out there. Let's get into the weeds. I'm going to get very detailed here. Okay. So there was a publication ban brought down late in 2022. I think it was August, by the Defense Counsel for the four men. That publication ban was very narrow and specific about what it applied to. Okay. It was about information to obtain, which is this like technical legal term about the evidence that the RCMP and the Crown had brought to the judiciary to like get warrants, get legitimation to the arrests. And the defense was like, there's not a whole lot to this, and it's so inflammatory, it's going to prevent our clients from getting a fair pool of jurors to adjudicate the court case.
Right.
So, and the judge agreed. The judge is like, yep, these are unfounded, unproven allegations, and the media has to stop repeating them, right? Because all the media was doing was repeating what the RCMP and the Crown said. They weren't talking about any context. They weren't talking about any countervailing factors. They were just making it so that the Coutts four guys were enemies of the state and the bad guys, right? Because the regime, the government and the media needed bad guys, because everything that happened in Ottawa was totally peaceful. Everything that happened at the Pembina border crossing, Emerson and Manitoba was peaceful. Everything everywhere was peaceful. But all these guys and their guns and stuff, oh no, now we got our legitimation for the Emergencies Act. Judge saw that, said, nope, you can't report on this anymore, but only that stuff, right? That publication ban did not apply to already public information, did not apply to asking questions about the case, did not apply to contextualizing the case and placing it in the political situation in which it existed, right? The Canadian media were not prevented from asking questions like, why have these guys been denied bail? Why have these guys been in jail for almost 2 years? Why did their proceedings conveniently, the pretrial hearings and the motions to even get towards getting to the actual trial did not start until after the Public Order Emergency Commission was finished, which was 9 months after they got arrested? Why is it that two of those four men have stayed in extended periods of solitary confinement? Solitary confinement, by most measures of most governments around the world, is considered a form of torture. Those two men had not been convicted of anything yet, had no criminal records, and were still kept in solitary confinement. Why is that? These questions were not covered by the publication ban. But the Canadian mainstream media, CBC, CTV, Global, National Post, Globe and Mail, all of the fucking commentators, and I've got some special hate here, okay? This is going to get spicy, and it's going to get me in trouble with many people that listen to your show, and I don't care. People who are supposedly conservatives, people who are supposedly, rebels and freedom convoy supporter influencers with like tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter. Where the fuck have you been? Why aren't you asking these questions? They'll say, oh, we support the Coutts 4, but that's the end of it, right? There are legitimate questions that everyone could have asked about this case, and they did not. They did fucking not ask. Okay? Then there was a second publication ban, which came much later in the case, which was not specifically a publication ban on the Coutts 4. It was a downstream ban based on court proceedings, or I should say, there was a court case in October of 2023 with this newspaper in Quebec. And then basically the Supreme Court ruled that we're not allowed to talk about pretrial hearings at all about federal cases in Canada. That's ridiculous, and that's another argument. But this was another way for them to just say, well, we're just not going to talk about this, you know? And so the media hid behind these bans and said nothing, even though we have men in Canada in jail, denied bail twice by a judge who is an appointee of the Liberal Party, has donated to them 26 times and is a member of it. The only people who've asked about the state of the judiciary in Canada has been one article in the National Post, which correctly pointed out that 76% of the judiciary in Canada are members of and donors to the Liberal Party. So let's contextualize this further. If you're a lawyer in Canada, I'm not saying this about all lawyers, but a lot of them have their eyes on other things for their career. Perhaps in its appointment to the bench. Perhaps it's a career in parliament or in politics, right? If the party who's in charge, who are the foot soldiers of the Laurentian elite that really run Canada, if you do something in your career as a lawyer to annoy them, what's your chances of getting an appointment to become a judge if all of those people you just annoyed by pointing out the truth and the facts about a political case, what happens to your future career prospects if those people you've just annoyed are in charge of you moving forward? Right? There's like so much corruption here. And again, nobody is talking about this. Nobody is framing it in this way, and not even the Conservatives. Right. Now, I'm going to get on top of the Conservatives here. There's a gentleman whom I now have a special loathing for that I sort of thought he was an all right guy. He wrote a book about the Freedom Convoy. He was like one of the first guys. He got like attacked by the cops. You might know him as Andrew Lawton. Before Christmas, Andrew Lawton was doing an AMA on his YouTube channel, and someone asked him, hey, how come you're not reporting on the Coutts 4 guys? And he's like, well, we don't have the resources and we don't have the money and the time. And he dissembled on it. And then he went off about well, if they are actually guilty of these crimes, maybe they should be in jail. Maybe they should have been denied bail. Dude, he knew nothing about the particularities of this case whatsoever. How is it that True North Center, who are supposedly this conservative media outlet, who are supposed journalists, couldn't talk to the Coutts 4 guys like I did? I don't even live in Canada anymore. I'm just a fucking truck driver with an opinion that was invited to write for Newsweek. The Coutts 4 families and their advocates talked to me. It would have taken Andrew Lawton or one of his people 10 minutes to send some emails to Margaret McKay or Nikki Tom or Jacqueline Martin or anyone and say, hey, we'd like to talk to the guys from jail. Have them call us. We'll write something about it. Nothing. National Post, Globe and Mail, nothing. These guys got used by the Justice Rouleau during the Public Order Emergency Commission when he sort of reluctantly allowed that Trudeau was within his rights to invoke the Emergencies Act because of all of this evidence he saw from Alberta. But it wasn't actually evidence. Rouleau said that before these guys went to trial, before any of the allegations against them were ever proven true. Right? So the whole POEC, which most people consider a sham anyway, But like, if you do consider it legitimate, if you're a normie that just believes what the CBC tells you, Rouleau fucking lied to you. Rouleau had no idea that anything alleged about the Coutts 4 guys was true or not because there was no trial yet.
Right.
Right? This whole situation is an extreme miscarriage of justice, and it brings into question your ability to speak your mind, to protest the government, to petition for grievances, to have, you know, to be able to like your freedom of association, right? These are big, big questions about what it means to live in a democracy. If the government can pick you up at a protest, throw you in jail, accuse you of the most heinous crimes, and believe me, conspiring to commit murder against police officers is pretty bad shit, right? And that's why most people were willing to believe the worst things that the media were saying about these guys. But none of it was true. It has never been true. It has been proven by the fact that 2 of these guys had all the charges against them dropped, and they pled for something which they were never originally charged with to get out of jail after 2 years of no bail.
Right.
And the conservative media is nowhere to be found. Andrew Lawton, where are you? Ezra Levant, where are you? Jordan Peterson, where are you? Rex Murphy, where are you? National Post, everybody, your country has just had its rights to freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of protest thrown in the gutter by the Trudeau regime, and you're like worried about ArriveCan. Like, I get it. The ArriveCan thing is like a big deal. But like, these men's lives and their families were fucking ruined by political expediency to cover up for Justin Trudeau, and you guys have said nothing, not a goddamn thing.
Right.
Man, I'm sorry, but like,
No.
I do not understand. I literally do not understand why there isn't like a media revolution in Canada right now going off at Trudeau about you. Like, Omar Khadr got taken to Afghanistan by his dad in 2001 after the fireworks started over there. Got in this firefight with the Americans. He was accused of killing an American medic, goes to Guantanamo Bay, spends many years there. The Canadian media made Omar Khadr a household name. They didn't shut up about that kid for 15 years. And then Trudeau gave him 10.5 million. Well, not Trudeau, the courts, but whatever. You get what I'm saying. And everybody knows about it. The Coutts 4 guys got basically the same treatment. And for what? For protesting. Mm-hmm. They didn't kill an American medic. They weren't involved in Afghanistan. They weren't involved with terrorism. They were just hanging out in Coutts saying, I'm sorry, people should have the right to their jobs without having to have their bodies invaded.
Yeah.
And now they've been in jail for 2 years. And the Canadian mainstream media have said not one fucking word or asked one question about how this happened. Nothing. Yeah. These people are fucking frauds. And I'm so sorry to be like yelling and carrying on about this, but like, you guys have to understand how serious this is, like what just happened.
Yeah, well, let me jump in here because I think I have a part of it. And this is not in defense of anybody. I don't know what's going on with Jordan Peterson or any of the, major personalities, Rex Murphy. But what I will say is that as it pertains to Canadian independent media, I think what they're experiencing or what they're doing is exactly what mainstream media does. Culture war issues move the needle, right? Trans issues or racial issues, right? They move the needle, which generates conversation, which generates clicks, which generates ad dollars, right? In this case, what we're seeing is a gigantic miscarriage of justice against 4 innocent men. And they don't tackle it because it's not moving the needle, because Canadians don't know what to think and they don't know what to do and they don't know anything about it, because in this case, the Iron Curtain that's been erected around it has been very successful. And so that's
it sure has. And those people need to be held to account.
Right. And so I'm not I'm not saying that they don't bear any responsibility whatsoever, because I think they do. But what I am saying is that I think, and this is a flaw of the so-called freedom movement in general. A lot of it is money driven. A lot of it is perceived empire building and trying to basically become the new mainstream media, right? And so, right, exactly. And so in that effort, what they do is they choose subjects and topics that move the needle and draw a response from the public, and bring that engagement that they need in order for them to continue to profit. And your
Right. That's part of it. I would submit to you, sir.
okay.
And I'm not disagreeing with anything you just said. That's all true. Another component to this is political expediency, right?
Yeah.
So, again, we have to situate this in the political context in which it resides, and that is that Justin Trudeau is not doing so good in the polls. Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party are probably going to win the next election. Probably. But that election may not be till 2025. And a year in politics may as well be a millennia, and many things can change. And I have it on good authority from a conservative media insider who shall remain nameless, because I don't want to get him in trouble. But a lot of these people are more worried about making sure that Poilievre's ascent to 24 Sussex Drive goes smoothly and without any bumps than they are worried about standing up for the principles at play with what happened with these men. They view any connection to the Coutts 4 as problematic, because then the CBC and all the rest of these leftoid losers are going to attack them in the media and slow them down. Mm-hmm. The problem is we have facts now, right? Stephen Johnston, the Crown attorney, Crown prosecutor, just like vaporized all the serious charges against Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin. Okay, so conspiracy to commit murder. You held these guys in jail for 2 years and then just dropped it? Hello? Is that what's going to happen with Carbert and Oleanick? I mean, that remains to be seen. But like, and then we also have, if people will remember, Canadian Parliament, members of the Senate were all freaked out about Diagolon and this Jeremy McKenzie guy. I wrote an article, not necessarily defending Jeremy McKenzie, but like talking about his debanking in an American magazine called Compact. And I interviewed Jeremy. They made him out to be like some kind of threat to the nation, and then connected him to the Coutts guys, which is baloney, because 3 of them had no idea who he was before this even happened. And a podcaster does not a threat to the nation make in the way they framed it. And last year, documents were revealed that showed the RCMP and CSIS said the same thing, the whole Hategate affair. Nothing. No coverage from the CBC, CTV, National Post, nothing. Like, documents showing that the government freakout over McKenzie and his fictitious meme country were used to help invoke the Emergencies Act and used to help convict the Coutts guys. None of it was true. Mm-hmm. The facts are in. What's today? February 15th, 2024. I'm sorry, guys. All of the facts are in now. All of the facts show that what happened to the Coutts 4 guys was a lie, false charges, false confessions on their pleas to get out last week. The whole story is baloney. We have the receipts. It's time to start asking questions. Mm-hmm. Where are these people? I get it that like they're busy focusing on the culture war stuff, and that's fine. But like, let's set that aside for a couple of weeks and start discussing the pillars upon which democracy is built, which is your right to protest, your right to an opinion, your right to freedom of association, all of which were vaporized in the treatment of the Coutts 4 guys.
I agree completely. And I think what you're saying is really important. because yeah, we can focus on the culture war stuff, and that stuff is important. But what's happening to the Coutts 4 guys is the result of the culture war. This is where we go, right? This is where we're going. And so I agree with you completely. I think that the coverage needs to be a little bit more balanced. Sure, do your clickbaity videos and articles or whatever, the stuff that pays the bills. But in the meantime, you got to tell these stories, right? Because these stories are important. And if you're going to consider yourself a journalist, this is probably the most important political story running in Canada right now. So what I want to do is I want to wind it back, because a lot of, as I said earlier, roughly about half our audience is American. And so they may not be familiar with this story. So can you, Gord, tell us the sequence of events that led to these 4 men being arrested in the first place?
Wow. The sequence of events, it's pretty simple. Um, 3 of them were hanging out at Coutts for quite a while, and the RCMP had engaged in a dragnet operation to find justification for the invocation of the Emergencies Act that they knew it was coming down. The conspiracy to murder police officer charges curiously didn't come down until almost 2 days after they were arrested, which indicates, there's some effery going about. But yeah, Jerry Morin. Jerry Morin's a curious case because him and his wife Jacqueline didn't really participate in Coutts that much because they got stuck up in Milk River. So there's another community north of Coutts, and the cops had shut the road down. And the only contact I think that Jerry Morin had ever had with Coutts was like he helped this country singer come down there to help perform, and then he got implicated in the bringing of a hockey bag with the cops said it was all guns and stuff, but it turned out to actually just be toys and shit for kids. But the RCMP said, oh, they were talking in code, and this actually meant there was all this baloney. And Jerry Morin, he's a lawful, legal, law-abiding gun owner. All his guns were at home, like 5 hours from Coutts. And they went and raided his house after, and then charged him with all his stuff that's nonsense. But the leading up to it was just basically the same as what was going on in Ottawa. Canadians, regular working class Canadian people, mostly truckers, hanging out at the border at Coutts, saying enough is enough. And the cops came in and started executing raids. There are things I know about those raids, and there are things there's information I'm privy to about what went down there that I can't comment on right now because of the outstanding pretrial hearings against Chris Carbett and Tony Olenek. But let's just say that it's the entire thing is even more fake and stupid on the part of the government than what we even know.
Wow.
It's bad. It's really bad. And these guys were literally arrested along with 9 others. And let us not forget, at Coutts, 13 people got arrested, and not even all at Coutts. Jacqueline Martin got arrested later. Jerry Morin got arrested later. A bunch of people were charged that didn't get arrested. There was 13 people amongst 2 different groups. It's a bit more complicated than what the media wants us to think about, as all things are. And this is the problem, is that there's been no substantial, significant reporting on this, not by the CBC, not by anybody else. Even when, the CBC and all the rest of them said nothing about these guys for ever since the beginning. And then all of a sudden, Jerry Morin and Chris Lysak get their plea deals and get out. And all of the media were just like, oh, yeah, they pled down to lesser gun charges. And that's it. There was no question about why were they denied bail. Oh, they were accused of conspiracy to commit murder? Yeah. How did that just disappear? There was never any questions about it.
Where did that charge come from, the conspiracy charge?
Good question. Let's zoom out. The RCMP are corrupted, and are ideologically tainted now. You remember the Portapique massacre in Nova Scotia?
Yes, I do.
And our former RCMP commissioner Brenda Lucki was implicated in like interfering in the investigation at the behest of Justin Trudeau, who was trying to get new gun control legislation pushed through.
Yeah.
I would submit to you that the RCMP were utilized in the same way as they were in Portapique to activate a preferred political outcome rather than actually deal with the law.
Right.
And that's what went on. And again, Tony Oleanick and Chris Carbert are still in there. There's details I know because I've been reporting on this and I'm connected to them that I can't talk about. And let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay. So for our American listeners and just Canadians who may not know, Coutts is a border crossing here in Alberta that was blockaded by protesters during the Freedom Convoy. And so I'm just going to recount real quick, and you just tell me if I'm right or if I'm wrong. You have these groups of people down at the border. These three men are charged or accused of transporting weapons or firearms, right? And there's a conspiracy to commit murder against an RCMP officer charge that's later brought down on these guys. And the accusation is that these four were conspiring to murder a police officer that would then trigger a series of events and lead to an insurrection here in Canada, correct?
I mean, that's what they were getting at, but they built it on a concoction, like a literal fantasy based on, one of the accusations against a couple of these guys is they were members of a Telegram group, right?
Right.
And that the guy who ran that Telegram group was giving them orders. Nobody ever asked the question, how come the guy that ran that Telegram group was never arrested?
Right.
Where's he? What's his name? We don't know. He was never arrested and never charged with anything. Since when did being a member of a Telegram group or a Facebook group or an email list, just simply being a member of it, when does that, how does that mean anything?
Right.
You're taking in information. That doesn't mean you're acting on it. That doesn't mean anything. And it's funny that the RCMP made all this noise about this Telegram group, yet the guy that ran it has never been arrested, never been charged with anything. He's still out there.
Do we know? Do we know?
No, I have no idea who it is.
So I want to pause.
That's that's part of the problem here. Like,
right.
If this guy was running an insurrectionist movement and he was a legitimate threat to the state,
right?
Don't you think he would have been arrested or charged with something by now? It's
right.
vaporware. It's nothing.
So is it possible that, and this is just pure speculation, but is it possible that the person who was running that Telegram group had something to do with Canadian intelligence, was planning these ideas in this Telegram group? You got a group where it's just guys shooting the shit. Maybe some things are said or insinuated, and that is what triggers these men to be and I'm just speculating. I have no idea, but
sure, no, that's a fair enough speculation, and I don't have an answer to it. But the answer is staring us in the face. The guy who ran this Telegram group still walks amongst us.
Right.
No charges, no arrest. So if this guy was such a danger to the country, and this guy was ordering the Coutts 4 to shoot people and engage in an insurrection, where is he and how come he's not in jail?
Right.
Vaporware, dude. It's fucking vaporware.
Right. And so how does Jeremy Mackenzie and Diagolon come into the picture here? And maybe can you describe Diagolon for people who may not be aware of what it is?
Diagolon are the people listening to this show. No, seriously. Right. Diagolon is the fan group of this Jeremy Mackenzie guy. And the only reason he's implicated is because when the cops raided the trailers and trucks of people assembled at Coutts, they found a tactical vest with 2 homemade Diagolon patches sewed onto it, which is evidence of nothing except that whoever owned that vest may have been a listener to Mackenzie's show. The problem here is that Mackenzie had been the target of these guys called the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, who are taxpayer funded social justice activists that tell the government what it wants to hear, right? So there's no connection between Diagolon and the Coutts guys, except the one fella, Chris Lysak, was a fan of Jeremy Mackenzie's show and met him once at a barbecue in Saskatchewan. Is it illegal to be a fan of a podcast? Are the people listening to your show, Jason, should they be worried they're going to get arrested?
No, absolutely not. No.
Right. So this connection that the media tried to make, they tried to say that because one of these four guys listened to Mackenzie's show, and because this vest showed up in raids by the RCMP, that somehow there was this connection to a group of people who listen to a podcast. Therefore, violent January 6th overthrow of the government. Like, where are the questions about what Diagolon is? Right. And like Mackenzie said it himself in the Public Order Emergency Commission, which anybody can go watch on YouTube. You know, this is the biggest military intelligence failure in Canadian history. The guy runs a podcast. He might say things that you don't like. He says things that I don't like. That's fine. This is not, you're allowed to say things, right? These guys, Canadian Anti-Hate Network, were like the Grima word tongue of Justin Trudeau, whispering in him and Marco Mendocino's ear about, oh, white ethno-nationalists, heavily armed, they're going to overthrow the government. Oh, okay, cool. So a guy with a couple of thousand podcast listeners is going to like rise up and overthrow the government? Where's your proof of this?
Right.
They tried to get the RCMP and CSIS to come up with proof of it, and the RCMP and CSIS couldn't come up with anything. And then when documents were released later that were required under a Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy, FOIPOP, which is the Canadian equivalent of a FOIA request,
right,
showing that there was nothing to any of this, the media said nothing. One lady in Toronto, two, I should say, Kara Mossad and Elise Hadigan, and I understand they've had some issues since then, but that's not our conversation. But anyway, they went through 1,200 documents from the government, and the government said, yeah, Mackenzie says stuff that some people don't like, but there's no evidence here that they're even a group. There's no evidence that they're armed. There's no evidence that they're a threat to anything. Okay, cool. So we have a couple of problems here. These guys in Coutts were thrown in jail based on guilt by association to a group. And then that group turns out to be fans of a podcast who are not actually armed and ready to overthrow the government. They are fans of a podcast. So we have two levels of utter and complete BS by which the government used to put four men in jail for 2 years. Their lives and their families ripped apart for 2 years based on bullshit.
Right.
Okay? Where is the inquest? Where is the investigation? Where is the Conservative Party? Where is the media? Right? Like, we have a democracy here, and we're not supposed to have political prisoners. These guys were thrown in jail in part, and the majority, and all of the like fire and brimstone coming from the government and the media, based on lies.
Right.
Like, hello, is anybody listening?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, so I was talking to Robert Malone a while ago, and he brought up something important that I think is relevant to us here. You know, the January 6th insurrection needed to, well, quote unquote insurrection, the January 6th incident needed to be framed as an insurrection in order for the US government to invoke the 14th Amendment, right? And this seems like a very similar scenario here in Canada. The Coutts 4, or this conspiracy to commit murder charge, there had to be some some deeper insurrection conspiracy in order to give precedence to invoke the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, it legitimized the Emergencies Act, which otherwise, and has been proven at the POEC. And recently, we had this federal court ruling that said, Trudeau's invocation was illegal. There's mountains of evidence to show that this invocation of the Emergencies Act was like the greatest abuse of state power in Canadian history ever. All of the evidence is there, right? But people don't want to hear it. And there's a conspiracy of silence around it. Like, even after two of these guys got let out and the charges against them were dropped, maybe I missed it. Maybe I should have done a little more research before I logged on here with you. But I haven't seen the Globe and Mail or the National Post or CBC being like, oh, hey, by the way, you threw 4 guys in jail over charges that later got dropped and you denied them bail and they were effectively political prisoners. What's going on here? Yeah. Nobody's asking these questions. And in fact, I'm going to name some names. There's a guy who I referred to as a see you next Tuesday, CUNT online, named Matt Gurney, who's a contributor to the National Post, and he runs a podcast called The Line. And he pretends like he's an outsider and we don't take any BS and we hold everybody accountable. I've been bugging that guy to report on the Coutts 4 for months, right? Because I follow his Substack. I've messaged him. I've quoted him. I've harassed him literally on Substack. Hey, dude, when are you going to talk about this? He comes back to me a couple of days ago and says, there's nothing here. There's nothing to report. I have emailed Peterson's people. I've emailed the National Post. I've sent like my Tucker interview to various media outlets and got nothing. They literally don't care. Canada, you need to wake up. Andrew Lawton don't care. Matt Gurney don't care. Ezra Levant doesn't care. Most of the Canadian media don't care. They do not care. Your rights to freedom of speech, your rights to protest, your rights to freedom of assembly, your rights to freedom of association are gone. They can pick you up and throw you in jail and do this to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And nobody's talking about it except me. And like a super tiny small amount of people on the fringe. And I go on Twitter and everybody ignores me. It's just like, what is going on here?
Yeah, well, again, I think it has to do with the complexity of the issue, I think, and trying to untangle it all, right? You're one of the rare intelligent guys out there that can break this all down, right? For most people, it's like, oh, they want to, cut Billy's dick off. That's bad. That's what I'm fighting for, right? Because it's a simple issue. It's
sure. It hits home.
Yeah. Child mutilation is wrong. We know that.
Yep.
We are against that. Why do they want to mutilate children? But this is more complex because there's multiple layers and there's a lot implicated here. Exactly what you said. Our freedom of speech is being infringed upon. Our right to protest is being taken away from us. Our right to assemble is being taken away from us, right? What this case tells us is that if, for whatever reason, they decide that what you're doing is effective, they are going to do whatever they can to frame you and shut that shit down, no matter how unlawful it is. And that's what the invocation of the Emergencies Act showed us, right?
Yeah, no, we're and this is not unique to Canada. As you said, we have the January 6th incident in the United States. And like, if you want to really zoom out, I'm a big fan. I don't want to say I'm a big fan, but like there's ideas coming out of what's referred to as, the sort of dissident sphere in the United States and various places about like examining how power actually works, how it's distributed, what it looks like, who's in charge, what you're allowed to say. And, Curtis Yarvin uses this term called the cathedral, which is the sort of confluence of the government, academics, and the media, and the sort of ideologies they push, and how that informs how the rest of the government actually functions. And, the Freedom Convoy and the reaction to it and the downstream consequences we are still facing indicate that like what Yarvin is saying is true. Like there's another concept that's not, I'm not sure who first brought this to the fore. I heard it from my buddy Merrick on the Good Old Boys podcast down in the US. Again, shout out to everybody in the US who's paying more attention to the Freedom Convoy in Canada than Canadians are. But there's this term called power petitioning itself, which means if you're Black Lives Matter, if you're Rainbow Flag Coalition, and you have a protest, you get positive media coverage, and everybody says you're right, and there's historical grievances, and you guys have been oppressed. If you're the Freedom Convoy, if you're somebody in the United States that's like skeptical of how voting is going, that's coded as right-wing, and that's disapproved protest, and will be crushed by the full weight of the state. So you have two levels of freedom of speech and two levels of protest, where one type of protest for one set of issues is allowed and promoted and actively encouraged by the regime, and then others which are not. So it's like it's a two-tier society, right? So people need to remember, especially those folks listening to the show, what tier you're on and where we are at. The government doesn't care. There's no equal rules for anybody anymore. We do not live under the government that your grandparents grew up under. It's gone.
Yeah.
It is gone, and it has been infected and subverted by something else.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get fair treatment. You're not going to get equal treatment before the law. There's a two-tier society, and most people in Canada that supported the Freedom Convoy are not part of it.
And just to be clear, in case you didn't understand what Gord was saying, this two-tiered society is basically, first tier is obviously people who are in line with the ideology that birthed the current regime. Therefore, their activism, or whatever you want to call it, is supported. And there are those who are against, and that activism or protest is not supported. And in fact, in most cases, like we saw in Canada with the Freedom Convoy, is persecuted to the highest extent, to the furthest extent possible. Now, Gord, we have a federal ruling that came down a few weeks ago that determined the invocation of the Emergencies Act was not justified. It was unlawful. It was not in line with the requirements in order to do so.
With the charter,
yeah, with the charter. And so, as a result, we have 2 of the 4 men have been released as a result of plea deals. Now, are these 2 circumstances related?
I don't know. I don't think so, because most people who've been charged and are facing all of this persecution downstream of the Freedom Convoy were charged under the criminal code, which, points out 2 things. This court ruling is not going to do very much technically. Maybe it might, like, sort of in feeling, but it also proves that the invocation of the Emergencies Act wasn't necessary. Everyone was charged. Everyone who is involved with the Freedom Convoy that has been charged, and I would argue unfairly, was charged under the existing criminal code. The invocation of the Emergencies Act was not necessary, right? And never mind the Coutts 4. There are a number of people still facing spurious charges. Their cases are still going through the court. There's a guy named Guy Meister from Nova Scotia who's back in court in Ottawa. He was one of the first truckers arrested after the invocation came down. There's a number of like nobodies you've never heard of who were charged with like intimidation, failing to obey a police order, all these dumb charges that were then later acquitted. Like they've already gone to court in Ottawa, had their stuff acquitted or dropped or stayed or whatever. And now the Crown is appealing them. There's a great Twitter account, Legally Purdy. She used to be called Miss Cannabis Court, and she's documenting this stuff. The government is literally coming back to people who've already been acquitted for their basic participation in the freedom convoy of advocating for their rights and their legal right to protest, ruled that they did nothing wrong. The government is appealing those rulings and hauling them back to court. There's this concept in the United States that's been immigrated to Canada called lawfare, where if the government and powerful forces cannot actually do anything to you legally, what they do is they pull you into the justice system with spurious charges and allegations, even if they know they're going to lose, and then they delay it, right? So like one of the reasons that the Coutts guys have been in prison for so long is that there was no disclosure. The Crown would wait until the last minute to disclose evidence, to disclose documents. We saw this with Chris Barber and Tamara Leach in Ottawa. We're seeing this with all these other cases. The Canadian government has imported this American legal technique called lawfare, which has been used against Donald Trump, which has been used against the J6 protesters, which has been used against any number of hundreds and thousands of people across the United States by the government to attack people that they normally have nothing against. They've got no legal recourse against them. There's many people in the Canadian media, right? The Cathedral Nord, as I call it, who are like, oh, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are importing Trumpism. We're importing all of these bad elements of the far right to Canadian politics, and this is bad, and we should reject it. What's actually being imported to Canada is the abuse of the legal system by the government to attack critics of that government and to attack protesters. That's what's coming to Canada. Never mind Poilievre, never mind Trumpism. The government is literally importing tactics being used by Democrats and the Biden administration and various other agencies in the United States. That's what's coming to Canada, and we see it all across the court system.
Now, here's the question I want to ask you. Have you ever put any consideration into the idea that maybe these tactics are not coming from the United States, but they're coming from somewhere else and have been...
Well, sure. There's the whole idea of like globalism, and we have, Mr. Schwab and the World Economic Forum. And, I'm old. I just turned 45 a couple days ago. I grew up. Oh, thank you. I grew up in the shadow of like the Battle of Seattle, and there was another one in Quebec City, and everybody on the left was like, the hell with the IMF and the WTO and all these bad trade deals and everything that's happened to South America. And, like I'm an old school lefty. Yeah. I oppose corporations. I don't believe in corporations. Even as a libertarian, as I grew into later in life, corporations are creations of the state. My politics largely, maybe they've adapted a little bit around the edges, but they haven't changed. I was against the war in Iraq. I was against the war on terrorism. I was against what happened in Afghanistan. All of this stuff that like the conservatives later came to, some of them had to come to apologize about, right? Like I went on Tucker Carlson recently. Tucker Carlson is the only mainstream media figure in the United States to apologize for being wrong about the second war in Iraq. He looked at everything that happened and was like, man, I got that wrong. I'm sorry. Not one single other mainstream media journalist in the United States has said that. Right? So like, I was against all that stuff. I went to anti-Iraq war protests. Like I've broadly been against powerful forces dictating to society how things should be and abusing that force and abusing that monopoly on violence, which is basically what the state has. And fast forward to 2020, and now the left, broadly speaking, have switched positions with the right. They're like, no, foreign corporations, pharmaceutical companies dictating to our governments how things are going to be. Oh, that's fine. If you oppose that, you're some kind of fascist. Doctrinaire fascism, okay? If you study where all of these ideas came from. One of the foundational pillars of the idea of fascism is the cooperation between government and corporations about how the economy is going to function and how society is going to function with very little democratic input, if any at all, right? Business and government saying, we are the guys in charge, and this is how it's going to be. That is one of the foundational pillars of fascism. What have we seen across the West for the last 4 years on steroids? Mm-hmm. I'm a fascist for opposing this. Are you a fascist for opposing this?
Well, that's the trick, right? The trick is the trick is to call you what they are, right? And so I spotted this very early on because, like you, I grew up reading. My nose was always in a book. I was reading Dante in the 9th grade. You know, like I was like you. That's how I learned to read or learned to write. And I spotted this like the moment I heard the World Economic Forum say public-private partnership, I was like, fascism. Fascism. Yep. That is fucking fascism. That's what it is, defined and put into other words, into words that are easier to absorb and to hear. And so that's why I asked that question, is where is this all coming from? Because if you look at the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United States, we're all doing the same thing at the same time, just to varying degrees, right? And that's the part that really warps my fucking brain. Like, you saw this happen with January 6th. You saw that they had to designate it as an insurrection in order to invoke the 14th Amendment. You saw how they went after those people. You saw how they went after Trump. And now here in Canada, 1 year later, the exact same scenario plays out. These 4 gentlemen in Coutts are accused of conspiring to commit a police officer, being part of a terrorist network that extends all the way to Ottawa, that for whatever reason is supposed to trigger an insurrection, and therefore the Emergencies Act is invoked. And now here we are. And as you mentioned, there are lesser known names that are currently wrapped up in all of this legal red tape. And people who are just being completely victimized by our government for the fact that they were involved in the biggest civil rights movement in the history of our country.
Yeah. And again, you know, I was picking on the conservatives before for not doing enough to question their own priors, to question their commitments to all of these principles. Now it's our turn to pick on the left. Why is it that Pfizer, the most, you know, they have faced the largest lawsuits against any company on planet Earth ever? Why were they allowed to dictate what happened in the world in the last few years? Why is it that questioning, even the act of questioning the influence of organizations like the World Economic Forum, who are extranational and outside of the realm of democratic accountability? You can't vote for the WEF. You can't vote for all of these NGOs and foundations and all of these people who say, well, we're trying to help and we're trying to influence policy. And they're very well financed by corporations and the very wealthy to put forward the interests of those corporations and the very wealthy. And then it gets laundered through these NGOs and foundations and nonprofits, right? There's whole towns here in the US that, like, their entire local economy has been replaced by being offices for these organizations. Mm-hmm. And they have the ear of Congress and senators, and you don't. When did that become okay for the left? When did it become okay for all of these organizations outside your ability to vote for them? Why do they get to stipulate what policies are going to be? Why do they get to dictate to our governments what's going to happen when you have no democratic accountability or mechanism by which to say no? Mm-hmm. Hello?
No, you nailed it, man. And you know,
this is why, like, what so we spoke earlier about spiritual journeys, right? Mm-hmm. I used to be a pretty strident atheist. I didn't believe in God. I thought religion was stupid. Mm-hmm. Every young man goes through this stuff, right? And I have really been awakened to where meaning is at, right? Like we're
Mm-hmm.
watching all of these institutions in society fail us in so many ways. And then you realize that all of the people running them are secularists. And if they believe in God at all, they keep it to themselves,
Yeah.
right? I'm not about to like make any claims of, metaphysics here. I'm not about to say to you that like, the Bible is real. But what I will say to you is that the meaning imbued in all of that stuff is extremely important to the functioning of society.
Yes.
And that all of my interlocutors, all of the people who have attacked me in the last few years, were all of my former atheist and secular former friends.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody who's been on the bad or wrong side of all of these questions are atheists and secularists who do not have their minds or spirits focused on that which is good and true or moral and ethical at all. And all of the people who've supported me, all of the people who've supported the Freedom Convoy, all of the people who've supported your rights to bodily sovereignty and bodily autonomy, most of those people were people of faith. Think on that.
Yeah, no, dude, I was just talking to a few other people about this the other day. Really what it is it's that as human beings, we always look for a higher purpose to serve. That's what gives us meaning. It shapes our ethics and our moral codes, right? And so that's what keeps the glue that keeps society together, is that we're all following the same higher purpose, the same ethical and moral codes. And so that's what keeps everything in order. And you're absolutely right. All of the people in my life that left me, that despise me now because of where I stand on things. And I'm like you, I'm 41. I'm from the same generation. I'm a lefty from back in the early 2000s, right? And the thing that I spotted was that all the neocons that we despised, the Rumsfelds, the Cheneys, the Bushes, they're all now on the left. That's neoliberalism now.
Right.
We didn't
Yeah.
change, right? But I guess the point that I'm trying to get to here is that what happens when you remove that higher purpose, that higher power that you're in service to, is that you look for something somewhere else to place that energy, something else to follow. And so what's happened is that this political ideology has become dogmatic unto itself, right? And that's why these people will just cut ties with you after. I mean, my best friend of 20 plus years stopped talking to me because I would not follow the cult. But he also was an atheist, right?
Many such cases.
And that's what I'm saying, right? Is it's interesting that that's the way it works, but I think it's just because those of us who at least somewhat have faith, now you don't got to be a Christian, it could be whatever religion you choose, you could even be agnostic, but as long as you believe that you're serving a higher purpose, right, you have meaning in your life, and that meaning is what encourages you to continue following the same moral and ethical codes. And that's, it's so interesting that you said that earlier about not changing, because I'm the same way. I still follow the same moral and ethical codes that I always followed. And that's what's brought me here, right? That's what's brought me in opposition to this thing that's captured what feels like the entire Western world. So, Gord, I know you got to go soon, but I want to ask you, just in closing, how do we fix this?
Oh
How do we
man.
change this?
I want to be epistemically modest and say I don't know. But like that's not very satisfying.
Right.
But then again, many podcasters, many people having these discussions say, well, we just got to keep talking about it. And I mean, there's some truth to that, but like, man, just keep aiming towards the true and the good and the beautiful. There are no solutions in politics. Our entire political system has been compromised. Voting's going to get you nowhere, and that which we see around us is probably doomed to collapse. And the best thing you can do is arm yourself with a foundation that brings you closer to that which is true,
Mhm.
that which is beautiful, that which is moral, that which is ethical, however that looks. And remember, remember who supported you when the chips were down. Remember who the people were who were people of action when those chips were down and when the situation called for decisive and principled action. Remember those people, stay friends with those people, maintain those connections. The ride's only going to get worse. I don't mean to sound like a doomer. I don't mean to sound like, a collapsitarian, but the forces at work which are arrayed against us aren't going to go quietly. And I mean, just look what's going on around us. Like, we have a legitimate, in the case of the Coutts 4, a legitimate attack on foundational pillars of what it means to be Canadian and what it means to participate in Canadian democratic society. A legitimate attack with receipts and with people and families who are affected by it, and not just the Coutts 4. James Sowery, Chris Barber and Tamara Leach, all these other unnamed people, Harold Jonker, Guy Meister, all of these people who are being attacked by the government that are going unreported on and unremarked on, and it's just happening. That's going to continue. It just is what it is, because the people that run our society don't care and are not focused on that meaning. So that means you have to be, and you have to reinforce your connections with others. Keep talking and just know inside that you're on the right track, and associate yourselves with others who are also on the right track, and find that meaning. Find those communities. Like I say, people will disagree with me about this, but I don't see any political solutions, and I don't think any effort towards politics is worth your time.
And so, who are the two men of the Coutts 4 that are still in custody? And is there anything that people can do to support them?
Tony Oleanick and Chris Carbert remain in custody. Their pretrial hearings resume on February 20th. And I'm working feverishly to get Tony Oleanick a spot in Newsweek. Hopefully he's going to be able to say something there. As for what we can do for them, just remember that you're not going to find any reporting on them in the mainstream media. You're going to have to come to podcasts like yours or mine, or, a small handful of people paying attention. And you can donate to their legal funds, right? So even though Jerry Morin and Chris Lysak are out, they still have outstanding legal bills. Tony Oleanick and Chris Carbert still have ongoing and yet to be outstanding legal bills. There's numerous give, send, goes for them. I started one myself because of some unfortunate and stupid nonsense that went on a few months ago around their fundraising. I can't comment on any of that, but go to Give, Send, Go, search Trudeau's political prisoners, search any of the men's names if you want to contribute directly to them. They're all on there. We need money to fight the Leviathan state, and just be there. Just talk about it. Just keep talking about it. We need all hands on deck talking about this, especially online. The conservative media sphere won't touch it. The regular liberal Trudeau subsidized media won't touch it. You got to be there, and you have to shame all the big names into talking about it and keep pressing them on it so that they will not ignore it. This case is the biggest. I can't begin to describe how important this is to whatever your concept of what it means to be Canadian, or a member of democracy, or an enjoyer of freedom of speech. Everything about that is encapsulated in this case, and you must stay on it. You, the person listening to this.
Yeah. What it means to be free is hinged on this. So
yes,
for
exactly.
For people listening, I'm going to have Gord send me the good links once we're done here, and they will be in the description below. Whether you're listening or watching, there in the description of this podcast, you can go there and contribute. And listen, guys, I know that there's a lot of alarmism in the world now, especially in the West. Everything is a fucking nuclear bomb. But this is an important issue, because These men have been clearly set up. If you read Gord's work at Newsweek, he breaks it all down very eloquently and into bite-sized facts. It's not, 10,000 words. You don't have to commit an afternoon to it. It's a 5-10 minute read. But we look, regardless of what you think of this case, if you know anything about it at all, right? The fact of the matter is that we have 4 men who sat in solitary confinement for 2 fucking years. 2 years, right? Most human beings, your brain turns to mush after 6 months of being completely isolated. These men sat there without a court date, with nothing, just sat there waiting in remand for 2 years in solitary confinement. And that alone is an injustice. That in itself is an injustice. We need to demand better. And if we're ever going to do better, this is how we do it. It's more than just talking. We gotta put in some action here. Gord, do you have anything to say before we close?
Yeah, no, just pay attention to what's coming down the pipe next week. Be critical of what you see from CTV, CBC, and all the regime fillators and regime stenographers whose job is to lie to you about things. And just keep your attention focused on that which is good and was true, and keep these men front and center. Keep this case front and center, because your rights to a free society hinge on what comes of these men's case.
Yes, absolutely. So, Gord, hang around for a few seconds. Once we're done recording, we'll say goodbye privately. But in the meantime, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
So I write mostly at my own Substack, autonomoustruckers.substack.com. I usually repost things I write in other media. I've written for Newsweek, The American Conservative, Compact, American Affairs Journal, Unheard, a few other places. My podcast is called Voice of Gord, which is an inside joke making fun of this gravelly nonsense you've had to deal with for the last hour and 40 odd minutes. Found on all your major podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, Podverse, all the rest of them. I'm out there. I've interviewed people very close to this case, including Nikki Tom, Jacqueline Martin, and Margaret McKay, names you might not know. And you might ask yourself, how come the mainstream media hasn't talked to these people who are intimately involved in this case? And why was it left to a fucking truck driver that lives in the United States now? So yeah, just search Voice of Gord and go listen to that stuff, and you keep your eyes open. That's all. Yeah, just stay awake, stay focused.
Dude, that was awesome. Voice of Gord is a good listen too, man. I dig it. I love it. So yeah, everybody listening, please go follow Gord, read his stuff. There's very few people out there that are really digging for truth and trying to bring it to light. And Gord is one of those people, and I highly recommend his work. Gord, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate your time.
No, and thank you, and thanks everybody for listening. Every minute of your ear time that you gave to us is a minute you didn't put towards something else. Time is finite, and I thank you greatly for your attention.